What would Avatar have been like if Aang never ran away? That's the question fans have had for years. Luckily for you, we believe that we have the answer. First, let's do a brief recap of exactly the situation that caused Aang to abandon his duties as Avatar in the first place. As we all remember, Aang had a very happy life at the Southern Air Temple, where he spent his days inventing new airbending games while he bonded with his father figure, Monk Gyatso. In the series, Aang overheard the other airbending masters telling Gyatso that he was spending too much time distracting Aang from his Avatar duties. They were determined to remove Aang from Gyatso's care due to the increased tensions with the Fire Nation. This was a real blow to Aang, as his friends had already started to ostracize him due to his Avatar status. He hopped on Appa's back and ran away. During a particularly bad storm, Aang was forced into the Avatar state to freeze himself and Appa into an iceberg so that they wouldn't drown. Our version of Avatar will take a right turn instead of a left. That being said, Avatar: The Last Airbender is not a name that will work for this alternate series. Why don't we go with something new, like Avatar: The Legend of Aang? We'll also have to come up with an entirely different book system instead of Water, Earth, and Fire. We'll begin with our Avatar Book 1, Family. What would have happened to Aang in the world if he hadn't run away, though? Well, Gyatso wasn't exactly going to take that verdict without a fight. Considering the fact that he was the greatest airbender of that time, it's likely that he would have been able to keep Aang in his care. The kids that ostracized Aang would inevitably come back around. What's truly tragic about Aang's choice to run away is that all of his problems were likely temporary. Had he merely waited a few days, he would likely have returned to the exact life he'd had before. It's even more tragic to think that he probably would have had that realization and would have returned home shortly after leaving. The storm was more of the driving force keeping Aang from the world than I think he even realized. In the world where Aang decided to stay home, he likely would have had a lot more time with Gyatso and the air nomads. Now, that isn't to say that there wouldn't have been tragedy. As we all know, on the day of Sozin's comet, the Fire Nation attacked. Sozin knew that the Avatar was the greatest risk to the empire he wanted to build, and so he sent a brigade of soldiers to the Southern Air Temple to take Aang out. While Aang would have likely wanted to fight, Gyatso and the other airbenders would have hid him away. They would have known that the young Avatar was no match for a Fire Nation army, let alone one that was juiced up by the comet. So while Aang was forced to hide, the airbenders would have gone to war with the invaders. Seeing as we don't meet many true air nomads in the series, we can only speculate what such a battle would look like. Knowing air nomads, there would have likely been dozens of complex traps and strategies that would have kept the Fire Nation at bay with non-violence. Unfortunately, non-violence would not have been enough on that day. As we know, the air nomads all fell due to the enhanced power of the Fire Nation. In the end, only Gyatso was left. The world's greatest airbender would have likely put up quite a fight, but they would claim his life. At this point, many fans think that Aang would have lost his life as well. I think that discounts one major factor: the Avatar state. The second Aang emerged to see his people decimated, all those tattoos would have begun to glow. In a rage, Aang would have wiped out the remainder of the Fire Nation army, leaving himself alone in a temple of corpses. The ending of Aang's life with the air nomads would start his next chapter, Book 2, Study. So where does a young Avatar go when all of his people have been destroyed? Well, that answer is simple. He would have gone to see his good friend Bumi. Aang's first destination in his new adventure would be Omashu. His friend would convince him that he had to become the Avatar and must go to the Northern Water Tribe. Well, after they spent some time sliding down the Omashu delivery system, that is. Bumi would accompany Aang with Appa, creating a new, zanier Team Avatar. The two would likely go on many adventures on their way to the Northern Water Tribe. Frankly, without Sokka and Katara to keep Aang on track, it likely would have taken the pair much longer to reach the place. Once there, they'd discover a Fire Nation army already attacking the tribe. In the normal timeline, this initial attack wouldn't happen for years. Fire Lord Sozin was a clever one, though. If he knew that his armies found the Avatar but failed to capture him, he'd send his armies exactly where he knew they would go. This would likely play out much like it did in the original story. Aang would assist the tribe in fighting off the army using the Avatar state. Who knows, Bumi may have even had his own share of romance. Though it would probably be short-lived. His girlfriend might not become the moon, but let's face it, Bumi's mind is not exactly on this planet. The main difference in this timeline is that the waterbenders likely wouldn't have let Aang leave so quickly. He would have stayed in the tribe long enough to master waterbending properly, with no impending deadline making him rush through the elements. After a few years of training, the teenage Aang would be ready to set off with Bumi and likely a water tribe friend he would have made. Considering the fact that Pakku and Gran would still be super young, this would likely be a character we wouldn't know. For the sake of fun, let's combine Katara and Sokka's qualities into a new sarcastic waterbender named Kataka. I expect no less than 1,000 fan drawings of this new brilliant character. Well, maybe just one would be cool. The new Team Avatar would be on their way to Ba Sing Se to find Aang and Bumi a proper earthbending teacher. The war had not yet reached Ba Sing Se, so they would likely get deeply involved in the city. There would likely be love, loss, and lots of great tea shops as Aang slowly mastered earthbending. This would have likely taken Aang several years to accomplish. Toph had a terrible time keeping him focused on it, and that was with Sozin's comet coming soon. Imagine how long it would have taken him without that motivation. By the time Aang would have been ready to master fire, he likely would have been a grown man. Not only that, but the Fire Nation was still actively looking for him. Team Avatar probably had to fend off several Fire Nation attacks on their way to Ba Sing Se. There was one advantage that Aang had though. He already had a friend in the Fire Nation, Kuzan. The trio would travel in secret to see Kuzan, where he would help Aang find a firebending master. They likely wouldn't have had much time for Aang to train in such a dangerous place, but eventually he would have mastered it enough to be complete as a full avatar. He would then watch Bumi and Kataka get married in the enemy country. It would be perhaps the last peaceful moment our Team Avatar would have had before they joined the war. Little did they know that there was a change happening in the Fire Nation. Fire Lord Sozin had passed. Fire Lord Azulon would now take his place. Aang would now have to face a new, younger enemy who was even more motivated to take him out than his father was. This would begin the longest chapter in Aang's life. Book 3, War. Unfortunately for Aang, the day he has been dreading for his entire adult life would now be upon him. He would have to enter the war against the Fire Nation. This version of Aang would not have spent months traversing through the war-ravaged world. While he would have seen more than his fair share of destruction and chaos, the war was more contained in those days. Our Aang would probably try to do things the air nomad way first. He would try to make a peace summit between the remaining 3 nations. This would mirror his efforts in Avatar: The Last Airbender, where he and his friends constructed Republic City. Only this time, things would not go as well. In that timeline, he had Zuko in his corner. In this timeline, he had Azulon, who had no interest in peace. After several days of the summit, Aang would likely feel optimistic. The Fire Nation appeared to be more open to negotiation than he thought they would be. This Aang would be more naive as to the true intentions of the Fire Nation, even if he had seen firsthand what they were capable of. Unfortunately, some lessons you have to learn twice. Without warning, the Fire Nation would attack the summit. This would come with reports that they had also attacked the Southern Water Tribe and the city of Omashu. With one attack, Azulon would have taken out 2 major cities while also capturing many leaders from the summit. Aang's naivety would have played right into Azulon's cunning plans. Not only that, but the news would get worse. He would rush back to his tent to discover that Bumi had been critically injured. He would likely make some joke about how he wanted to slide through Omashu one last time with Aang before passing away. This would get Aang into the war for real. If you stop and think about it, the only reason the original Team Avatar took down the Fire Nation so quickly was a combination of 2 things. 1, Sozin's comet really put them in a corner. 2, Sokka was a crazy genius. If either of those things didn't factor in, they likely wouldn't have been so eager to try as many crazy plans to end the war. So it would be very likely that Avatar Aang would spend years, if not decades, fighting against the Fire Nation. In fact, let's say it would take so long that Azulon's sons would have time to grow into young adults. At this point, Azulon would be straight up obsessed with destroying Aang. the only real rival to the Fire Nation. He would task both of his sons with infiltrating the Avatar's camp. Whichever brought Aang down would be the one to ascend to the throne after his demise. Iroh, a fierce student of the Water Tribe, would have joined Kataka's forces, while the young Ozai would have snaked his way into Kuzan's. The two would have bonded with their generals, but for different reasons. Kataka awakens in Iroh the truth about the Fire Nation and turns him from his mission. Ozai, however, would have manipulated Kuzan into returning his loyalty to his former home. All of this would come to a head on the fateful summer solstice, where Aang would finally face Fire Lord Azulon. For years, he and Kataka had been planning out an infiltration mission, and it was finally ready. Iroh and Ozai would be reunited, both with opposing plans on how to handle the situation. Team Avatar would sneak into the Fire Lord's throne room, where Aang would openly challenge their father. Azulon and Aang would have a fight very similar to Aang versus Ozai, with the same result. Aang would take Azulon's bending away, thinking he had won the war forever. Then he would be betrayed as Kuzan and Ozai attack. Aang would take down Kuzan with little effort. His old friend would feel ashamed of his actions, and the two would almost share a moment of reconciliation. Then Ozai would strike with a lightning blast, wounding Aang. He would go for a second, but Iroh would dive in, saving Aang. Aang and his friends would retreat, but it would be too late. Aang's wounds would be too much for him. Now an old man, he would smile at his old friend Kataka and tell her to find the new Avatar. She and Iroh would comfort him as he closes his eyes. Then, across the world, the eyes of the new Avatar would open. Avatar Katara of the Southern Water Tribe would begin her journey as Iroh and Kataka finally find her. Fire Lord Ozai would issue his two children the same orders he got, to find the Avatar and destroy her for the throne. And so, the legend of Katara would begin. And there you have it, our alternate Avatar. So what did you guys think of the Legend of Aang? Did you think the story would go a different way? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more from CBR.